What's up, guys? This is Timothy Grey Hat Allen. This is going to be part 3 of the Hand2note hero analysis. So we've looked at pre-flop play, we've looked at play as the aggressor, now we're going to have a look at play as a defender. We're going to start by looking at this particular hero's fold to c-bet stats on each street. I'm going to provide some basic values for what you'd expect to see when running some analysis with the Death Star 2 HUD. So we have our fold to c-bet in position lines. Those are the first dark cyan group of 3 stats you can see there, 23, 29, 25. So that is fold to c-bet in position on the flop, turn, and river. Then the 3 dark cyan stats below that are fold to c-bet out of position, 32 on the flop, 36 on the turn, 69 on the river. So what would we expect to see for those values? Well, for flop, we're going to be folding a little bit more often when we're out of position. That makes sense. And generally these values will be higher than players might expect that they should be. So many players think, perhaps as a misunderstanding of certain GTO principles, they have this idea that they need to defend the vast majority of their range when facing a continuation bet. So they need to defend maybe 70% or more of their holdings. In fact, this is what this hero is doing, because if he has a fold to flop c-bet in position of 23%, that means he is continuing with 77% of his range when facing a flop c-bet. This is actually too much. Even if you were to run some GTO style analysis, you'll see that we're not supposed to be defending 77% of our range on the flop against an average c-bet sizing. Could maybe be different if your population is using a large amount of 1/3 c-bets, for example. Generally speaking, hero is defending too much here when facing a continuation bet. As a good rough guide, and I recommend we play on the tight side here, we're looking for fold to c-bet on the flop in position. This is single raise heads up pots, by the way, of around 42%. In terms of fold to c-bet out of position in a single raise heads up pot, we want that number to be close to 50%, perhaps slightly under 48, 49%. So you can see we fold significantly more often when out of position, and we fold significantly more often overall than hero's current stats. In other words, we should actually be folding almost half of the time when facing continuation bet while out of position. And you can verify with some type of GTO solver work that this is not too far off a correct value. That might be slightly on the tighter side, but that's also a recommended way of playing, especially for newer players. And the reason is quite straightforward. Defending slightly too tight on the flop is only a small mistake. But when players defend slightly too wide on the flop, this tends to translate into bigger mistakes on the later streets when the pot's grown larger. In other words, by defending slightly wide on the flop, we're putting a lot of extra pressure on ourselves for the turn and river play. Some of these flop defends, even in theory, are barely going to be increasing our expectation. They're going to be very close to break even. But when we say they're going to be close to break even, that's assuming we navigate turn and river situations perfectly. If we actually mess up our strategy on the turn and river, which is likely to happen when we have a weaker part of our range, then we're not going to be breaking even. We're actually going to be damaging our win rate by defending the flop too wide. So we can see this here is defending too wide. Now if we have a look at the turn stats, what would we expect to see for those? Roughly 40% fold turn to c-bet. Now, in many cases, players are going to have a look at these stats and they're going to see that they are folding 55 or even 60% when facing a double barrel on the turn. Usually, we can isolate this to a problem with second pair type hands. So very specifically, if you're folding 60%, that must mean that you're folding second pair most of the time when facing a double barrel. And generally, that's one of the hands that we're supposed to defend when facing a double barrel. So usually, if you have a second pair type hand, it should call a flop and turn when facing a double barrel from our opponent, then consider folding the river. Top pair type hands should also call 2 streets, so if we find that we're folding the turn sometimes with top pair, that's also going to be a mistake, and that's going to drive up the fold to turn barrel frequency. Now, given that hero's values are definitely too wide here, it should be quite easy for us to pick up some examples. By the way, in terms of river fold to c-bet stat, that should actually be quite high. In most cases, a good winning player is going to have fold to river c-bet between 50 and 60%, both in position and out of position. Folding 60%, that's not a big deal. Sometimes players have a leak where they fold way too much on the river because they realize that bluff catching against triple barrels isn't a great idea against most populations. But even if we rarely bluff catch, we shouldn't have 80% fold to river triple barrel. That usually means that we're making a mistake on the flop and turn rather than a mistake on the river. So sometimes if a player has, let's say, 80% fold to river triple barrel, you might look at the hands that he's folding and see that they are all standard folds when facing river triple barrel. So it's not necessarily a river leak when the fold to river triple barrel stat is in the 70 or 80% region. It's usually a flop or turn issue. So let's have a look at the fold to c-bet. Let's pick one spot. Let's have a look at fold to c-bet out of position. Let's have a look at the hands that this player has called with when facing a flop c-bet out of position. So you can see the post-flop diagram there. Now, a useful trick here when analyzing defense against c-bets is to break it down by sizing. And this is included as part of the Death Star 2 HUD. We can see heroes calling frequencies against different bet sizing ranges. So we have call versus less than 0.2 pot or 20% pot size bet, call versus bet between 20 and 40%, between 40 and 60%, etc. So it makes sense that when we face that min bet, less than 20% pot, whatever the sizing is, that we're going to be defending wider in that spot. It's not going to surprise us if we see a larger amount of green there, green being the color for our trash type hands. So a logical way to break this down might be to break it down by sizing first. So if we hover over the 40 to 60% sizing, we can see an additional post-flop diagram that only includes hero's defending range when facing a half-pot bet. So now we know that when we hover over the trash category here, that might not be such a valid reason to defend a trash type hand. We might find hands that heroes defending too wide. Now, one thing to keep in mind in terms of the way that Hand2note classifies a trash type hand, this could potentially include some premium backdoor type hands. Now, it's true that there is the backdoor flush category there, but that actually only includes backdoor 2-card flush draws. So it could be that we have some premium backdoor 1-card nut flush draw with backdoor straight draw type hand in this trash category. So it's not guaranteed that all of these hands are completely hopeless. Let's have a look at some of the hands in the list. So you can see that first example, we actually have the 1-card backdoor nut flush draw. So it might be reasonable to defend against the half-pot bet. We also have the 1-card backdoor straight draw. So we have the backdoor straight draw with our 9. That means we have 1 backdoor OESD and 2 backdoor gut shots with our 9. Now what we want to see is if there are any hands that are going to be significantly too wide as defense. And there are definitely some hands here that don't quite qualify as defend. They might be close, but they're not quite going to be a defend. Let's pick out a few examples. So we can see that here he defended Queen Jack on a 7-6-4 texture, facing a bet of 3.5 big blinds into a pot of 6. Remember, this is all out of position as a cold caller and a single raise heads up pot. Here it checks the villain, villain fires a continuation bet. That's actually going to be a fold on that texture. Now, in terms of how wide we go, it is going to be based on the coordination on the texture. As a basic guide, the more coordinated the texture, the less we care about backdoor equity, the more we care about direct draws, simply because we're going to have a lot of direct draws in our range. And that's somewhat true on a 7-6-4. We're going to have things like 10-9 gut shot, 10-8, 8-9. We're going to have flush draws. We're going to have 1-card gut shots, things like ace-8 of clubs, for example. So because we have so many direct draws on a 7-6-4 texture, it's not necessary to defend something like Queen Jack high with a 1-card backdoor Jack high flush draw. It's just not worth it in this spot. It doesn't need to be in our defending range. We see similar things with the King Queen on the 9-7-4. Now we do technically once again have a backdoor. We have 2 backdoor gut shots here with our King Queen. We can catch a 10 on the turn, or we can catch a Jack on the turn. We also have overcards. But once again, due to the mid-range nature of this texture, we actually have plenty of direct draws. Think about all the stuff like Jack 10, Jack 8, 6-8, stuff like that, 5-6 even that we might have in our range. Also, in terms of backdoor equity type hands, if we are going to defend some backdoor equity in this spot, we're generally going to have stuff that has much better coordination than a King-Queen. For example, what about something like ace-8 of clubs? Not only does it have the 2-card backdoor nut flush draw, but it also has the 1-card, 2 backdoor OESDs and 2 backdoor gut shots. So that actually has a lot more potential. Ace-6 on a Jack-Deuce-Deuce should be a fold as well. Normally on these relatively nondescript dry textures, this is actually a type of paired dry texture, In terms of ace high type hands, we're probably going to draw the line somewhere around ace 10. So once we get to ace 9 offsuit, we don't need to defend that unless we have some kind of backdoor flush draw to go with it. Ace 6 is going to be way too wide. Part of the reason is we actually prefer to have hands like 10-9 of spades here, or maybe something like ace 6 with the ace of hearts. We prefer to have those kind of hands in our defending range. We prioritize those over something like ace 6 offsuit, which has a lot of raw equity, but doesn't really have very good playability. Ace jack too wide on the 10-8-4, ace 9's too wide on the 6-4 deuce. So you can see that if we continue, we're probably just going to find more examples of situations where hero has defended too wide. Now that's only one part of the problem. Another part of the problem could be that hero is raising too aggressively. Now we know he's not raising with a very high frequency. Not sure if you picked that up on the previous screen. But if we just have a look at the raise versus c-bet stats, we have check raise versus a flop c-bet 7.5, and raise in position versus an out of position c-bet from our opponent 12. So these are not super high numbers. They are nice and neutral values. They're certainly okay. Maybe could even be a shade higher. But of course, that doesn't mean that the right types of hands are necessarily being raised. So to continue with our theme of playing out of position against continuation bet, let's take a quick look at that raising range. Once again, it's possible to break things down by different sizings, to break things down by board texture. Let's not worry about that. Let's just have a look at the trash type hands that have check raised. Now against most opponents, exploitatively, we're generally looking to check raise quite a value heavy check raising range. So that's going to be strong value hands, that's usually going to be 2-pair plus, and it's going to be strong semi bluffs, things like flush draws, OESDs. By the time we get to gut shots, we don't really care about check raising those too much, and we certainly don't care about check raising backdoor equity. This is going to be one of the differences between a good exploitative strategy and a strategy that's going to be given to us by a GTO solver. Because if we have a look at solver output, we're going to be told to do things like check raise backdoor equity, we're going to be told to check raise a decent amount of gut shots. We don't actually need to do this exploitatively. As an exploit, we can stick to a very value heavy check raising range. So strong value hands and very strong semi-bluffs, flush draws, OESDs, that kind of thing. If we have a look at the post-flop diagram here, we can see that 4% trash and 16% backdoor flush. So although the overall check raising frequency doesn't seem super high, you can see that it's very likely that some bad check raises are taking place. Let's have a look at that trash category. So we can see backdoor 1-card flush draw has been check raised there. Ace 7, 1-card backdoor flush draw. Ace 10, 1-card backdoor flush draw. King Queen, that's kind of like a combo backdoor equity type hand. We have the 1-card third nut backdoor flush draw. We also have the backdoor OESD on the 10, backdoor gutter on the 9, backdoor gutter on the ace as well. But it's still not strong enough for a check raise, though it has some potential. Not the kind of hand we want to be check raising. So it's not surprising to see so many hands in backdoor flush. Remember, these are the hands that Hand2note categorizes as backdoor flush because they have a 2-card backdoor flush draw. So the ones we've just looked at were all 1-card. These are 2-card backdoor flush draws. They are slightly better than 1-card backdoor flush draws, but they're not strong enough in their own right to be check raising against the vast majority of player pools. Might be theoretically okay. Your solver might tell you to do this, for example. It's certainly okay against specific opponents who are folding too much to check raises, especially if they're folding more than about 50%. We can check raise very aggressively with this kind of hands. But against an unknown, average default opponent that we might run into at, let's say, 25 an hour, 50 an hour, something like that, low limit games, check raising is just not going to be the best option. In some cases, it might be marginally plus EV, but it's not going to be a better option than just peeling against continuation bet and then thinking about potentially pro-betting the river if the turn goes check-check. Or even in some cases just folding. It depends on how strong the hand is. I'm seeing that a decent amount of the hands in this list probably should be defense, so it might not be correct to fold these hands, but they're not quite strong enough where check raising is going to be the best option. Alright, so as a quick recap, here is probably defending too many hands when facing continuation bet. You can actually tighten up that defend versus c-bet range, both in position and out of position. And although here is not raising or check raising overly aggressively, he's actually check raising with the wrong type of hands, which is obviously not going to be good for win rate. Hopefully this gives you some ideas of what to look for when you're troubleshooting your own stats with Hand2note. In the meantime, good luck at the tables.